So for those of you who don't know what the Internet Security Alliance is, we are a small trade association based outside of Washington, D.C. We do not represent the cybersecurity industry. We are multi-sectoral, so we have everybody from AIG through Vodafone, virtually every critical industry sector, including Starbucks, which is among the most critical infrastructures, I think we would all agree. It usually takes me about a minute to go through that. So let's get right to it and what happened during the last minute on the internet. So every minute on the internet, this is what goes on. We lost 5,500 records. We lost about $4,400 due to cybercrime. 832 new versions of malware were created. We spent about $200,000 on cybersecurity tools. Spent another $200,000 on cybersecurity regulations and audits. That's what happens every minute of every day on the internet. They do not take off for Christmas or New Year's or whatever, 24/7 sort of stuff. If you add those things up, you get hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars that we're losing to cybercrime. The reality is we don't really know how much we're losing. We just know it's enormous because it's really hard to value things like the loss of intellectual property and the like. And then when you get to what we're spending on it, we're spending about $200,000 a minute on various regulations and audits, and these costs are projected to increase. They'll double in a couple of years and go up several hundred times since then. So that's the economic aspect of this. And now a reading from the National Security Estimate, which says, we must be prepared for a catastrophic, large-scale cyber strike. We've been living with a constant and expanding barrage of cyber attacks for some time. This insidious trend will continue. Cyber poses a very complex set of threats because profit-motivated criminals, ideologically motivated hackers, or extremists in various capable nation-states like Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran are all potential adversaries who can, if they choose, do us great harm. So that's the threat picture in a thumbnail. But fortunately, we have defenses. So let's take a look at it. I'm from the private sector, so we like to benchmark things, and who would be better to benchmark than against the military? This is a quote from the annual report from the Pentagon. The military's networks can be compromised by low to middling skilled attacks. Military systems do not have a sufficient robust security posture to repel sustained attacks. The development of advanced cyber techniques makes it likely that a determined adversary can acquire a foothold in most DoD systems and be in a position to degrade DoD missions when and if they choose. So, this naturally raises the question that if the largest, most sophisticated, best funded military system in the history of the world is subject to low to mid-level attacks, exactly what is it reasonable to expect from discount retailers like Target or movie studios like Sony or the state of New Jersey or pretty much anybody else? So we have a real anomaly here where we have sophisticated attacks, tons of them, and defenses that are porous. And now the bad news. That's not the bad news. This is the bad news. The bad news is things are going to get worse. Why are things going to get worse? Several reasons. First of all, the system itself is getting much weaker. Now, this is a pretty sophisticated audience, so I assume that many of you know that the system was designed weak. And by that I mean it was designed as an open system. It was designed in the 70s and 80s when information should be free and everybody should love everybody. And so we'll open this up. It'll be wonderful. And it is wonderful in a lot of ways, except it is designed as an open system. It is inherently insecure. In fact, you can find some of the guys who actually wrote the core protocols and stuff for the internet. You know, they're still around from the 70s and 80s. And one of the things they'll tell you is, you know, we were just trying to exchange some research papers back and forth. We didn't expect you to run the whole world on this system, but that's literally what we've decided to do. So we're running the whole world on a system that is inherently insecure, and it is getting more insecure. Why is it getting more insecure? Because we're opening it up even more. Everybody has smartphones, tablets, multiples of them, et cetera. And the reality is, we don't want to pay for security. I mean, how many people here asked about the security of their phone when they bought it? I always have a couple of people, raise their hands. I'm not sure. Okay, if you say so. If you say so. But most people don't. So we don't want to pay for security. And by the way, meaning no disregard to some, people, some of my friends here who worked in government, but this includes the government. So a couple of years ago, one of my companies had a secure problem with their laptops that they were selling to DoD. And the DoD came to them and said, these things are insecure. You got a supply chain problem. Supply chain problem, right, Joe? And the company said, well, okay, we can secure these laptops. It just costs you $2 more per laptop. And DoD said, no, thank you. So going into weapon systems, okay? No thanks, $2. And we have the IoT coming, bring your device to work. The system is weak and it is getting weaker. That's one problem. Second problem, the economics of cybersecurity all favor the bad guys, and I mean huge. So basically, this is the economic balance we have for cybersecurity. Cyber attacks are cheap. You can get them on the internet for a couple $100. They're easy to acquire, really profitable, great business model. You can use them over and over again, worldwide audience. On the other hand, defense, we're defending an inherently vulnerable system. We're inherently a generation behind the attacker. We have to wait to see what they're doing before we come up with our good defenses. It's hard to show return on investment to things that we prevented. And we have virtually no law enforcement. We may successfully prosecute 1 or 2% of cyber criminals. All the economic advantages favor the attackers. Finally, productivity enhancements. I mean, Michael was correct that most people, when they're developing new technology, and most organizations, including government, when they look at technology, look at what it can do for you rather than how they can secure it. So when you think about all of the major technological enhancements we've had over the last decade, the Internet of Things, voice over Internet protocol, cloud security, long international supply chains, on and on and on. All of these things are terrific for efficiency, cost effectiveness. They drive the bottom line, very productive for the entire economy, and virtually every one of them tends to undermine our security. So all the economic advantages favor the bad guys. And finally, and this is the worst news, the bad guys are getting better. So how many people know what APT means? What does it mean? Trick question. Used to mean advanced persistent threat, now means the average persistent threat. APT is a term that was developed by the NSA about a decade ago when they saw these advanced sort of techniques that involved people who were looking, who would do reconnaissance first. They would target people, not just networks. They would come at series of events. They would break into your system. They would read your incident response plan and then plan your attack knowing what you were going to do, and that's when the real attack came in. Very sophisticated stuff. 10 years ago, we saw this in the defense community. We saw it with nation states. Now we see it everywhere. The advanced persistent threat, those more sophisticated techniques, we now see at universities. We see in manufacturing. We see in retail. Target was a form of an APT style attack. They attacked the air conditioner vendor in order to get into the target systems. So these systems are becoming more and more common, these sorts of more sophisticated attacks. And the most fundamental thing about the APT is that they are going to get in. The most revealing difference is that when you combat the APT, your preventive efforts will fail. APT successfully compromises the targets that it chooses. So we are up against a very, very sophisticated sort of adversary. So, in summary, we have two kinds of attacks. I can divide attacks many, many different ways, but one useful way to think about the attack picture that we're currently facing is that we have what I'll call the vanilla attacks. And that's the vast majority. Your worms, your viruses, your junior varsity sorts of malware, and they're the vast majority. They can be very damaging, but they can be managed. These are the things that we can pretty easily manage from what we call cyber hygiene. good techniques that we follow, whitelisting things, closing off excessive administrative privileges, following the NIST framework, all those kinds of things. They will help you manage these basic sort of attacks. Then you have the ultra-sophisticated attacks, the APT attacks. These are well-organized, they are well-funded, they use multiple methods. Often they are state-supported. Michael was talking about the fact that we now have criminal activity and state activity. Actually, lots of times, the criminal activity is state activity. So the Bank of Bangladesh was attacked a year and a half or so ago. They stole a couple $100 million. That was the North Koreans. How do you think they are funding this nuclear program? They don't have any industry. They're stealing money. They are robbing banks. WannaCry, same thing. This was the North Koreans. The Office of Personnel Management, it was the Chinese government. So they are combining nation states. Plus, we have the same thing in our adversary states as that we have here in the U.S. People go into the military, they get sophisticated training, and they go into contracting. And they work for themselves, and sometimes they work for the government too. So we have a very convoluted system of an attack picture that is being developed here. One of the things I really want to emphasize is we shouldn't be confused by some of the really good, but in my opinion, methodologically challenged literature dealing with cyber attacks. So whenever you see a story, the Equifax story was mentioned already, the Target story, same sort of thing. Some guy, some writer, is going to write a story and say, oh, stupid, profit-oriented, selfish, dumb people, at Equifax, Target, Sony, wherever, if they had only downloaded this one patch, would have solved the problem. It's baloney. Yes, you can identify the one patch they didn't download, but you don't have to download one patch, you have to download them all. And by the way, for those of you who aren't sophisticated, putting a patch is not like a Band-Aid. A lot of times this is pretty sophisticated stuff. Depends on what kind of patches we're talking about, of course. But the point of the APT is that they keep coming at you, and eventually they find a hole in the dike. That's what the P stands for in APT, Advanced Persistent Threat. And we have to realize that they will get in if they are doing sophisticated sorts of things. I think part of the narrative that we really need to correct is that the problem with cybersecurity is that we have stupid, lazy, money-grubbing people running our cybersecurity. We probably have some stupid, money-grubbing people running some of our cybersecurity, but that's not the problem. The problem is we have an inherently vulnerable system protecting really invaluable data. That's the problem. And that's the problem that we really need to stand. We need to deal with the people problem also. But we have multiple different sorts of attacks. So, in summary, what are the barriers that we have to progress? Number one, the system is interconnected. There are incidents, many incidents, documented incidents, where organizations are doing a really good job with security, but they are undermined because they are interconnected to so many people. There's one story, it was in the New York Times a couple of years ago, about a really secure defense facility that was doing a real good job protecting their cybersecurity, but the bad guys, they do reconnaissance on people. They know who likes Manolo Blahniks and who's playing fantasy football, all this kind of stuff. They find this out about you. And they found out that the employees at the defense facility like to order out from a local Chinese restaurant. So they loaded the malware onto the online menu for the Chinese restaurant, and that's how they got into the defense facility. The system is interconnected. It's a very complicated problem. Anybody who comes at you and says, all we have to do is, they're wrong. It's not an all we have to do is. It's not downloading one patch, not just having a magic regulation. Those things, it's going to be more sophisticated than that. This is not consumer product safety. This is not like brake pads on cars. If you're coming up with a regulation to ensure that cars, you figure out the physics, if a car of a certain size going a certain speed, you need this amount of friction, and the math never changes. Okay, you change the variables around, but the math never changes. This is not that. It is not that we have bad technology. It is that the technology is under attack. That's an entirely different kind of problem. It's more like a football game. It's like we come up to the line of scrimmage and we have to, look over the defense, and they've got all sorts of, they putting 7 men in the box, in which case we got to throw over the top, or they drop back into, and they're doing all these feints at the time. This is an ongoing interactive process. The core problem, as I said, is not really technical. It's economic, and we have multiple different sorts of cyber threats. So when people talk about the cyber threat, really we need to be talking about multiple different areas of cyber threat. Remember, we're using these systems everywhere, for everything. So naturally, there's lots of different issues that we're going to deal with. So, on to solutions. So where are we going to find people to do this? I mean, where can we go to find some dedicated, sophisticated people who are really going to solve the problem for us? A little bit of a cheap shot. But the point I want to make is that we are not going to be able to rely on government for this. In fact, the administration's candidate to lead the CIA in her congressional testimony yesterday, Gina Haspel, made what I thought was a very adequate point, where she said the government is struggling badly with how to organize itself for cybersecurity. As somebody who has worked both in government and industry and has worked with government and industry for 15 years in this space, that is absolutely the case. We do not have 2 decades into this issue. We do not have a real sophisticated cyber strategy. We have not worked out what areas of government are going to do what things. Government is severely struggling. So this answer is probably not going to come from outside in. And by the way, I could put up a similar sort of slide about Silicon Valley. It's not going to come up from the bottom either. We are not going to invent some sort of magical technology. Blockchain is not going to solve this, because they use blockchain just like we use blockchain. They can adapt these things. What we are going to do is we're going to need to figure this out from the top down. So one of the areas that we think that we need to focus more on is corporate boards of directors. So a number of years ago, my organization, together with AIG, developed a program with the National Association of Corporate Directors to give them a handbook on cybersecurity. And it's been well received. It's been endorsed by NACD, by the International Association of Auditors, but notably also by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. Department of Justice. In fact, we did a German version of it, and it's been endorsed by the German government and the German Cybersecurity Alliance, and obviously ourselves. The point I'm trying to make here is that we need to be working together on this problem. It's not that government is going to answer it for us. It's not that industry is going to do it for government. This is a collective problem. The bad guys are attacking individuals and companies and governments. This is not like Enron, where we needed the government to step in to protect us from the avarice of the corporations. We're all on the same side. The bad guys are out there. Instead of pointing fingers at each other, which we do a lot of, we need to be working much more collectively together. As I said, we did one of these for the Germans. We did one of these for the UK. Just yesterday, OAS contacted us. They want a Spanish language version. And the reason is because this stuff actually works. So PricewaterhouseCoopers, who had no association with the creation of these handbooks, did a review in their, some of you may be familiar with their annual Global Information Security Survey, big survey, been doing it for 15 years, and they found that guidelines from the NACD advise that boards should view cyber risks from an enterprise-wide standpoint and understand the potential legal impacts. They should discuss cybersecurity risks and preparedness with management and consider cyber threats in the context of the organization's overall tolerance for risk. I think this may have been what Michael was alluding to when he said that here in New Jersey you've moved it out of strictly IT and into a broader context. I hope that's what the case is. Anyway, what PwC found was that boards appear to be listening to this advice. This year we saw a double-digit uptick in board participation in most aspects of information security. Deepening board involvement has improved cybersecurity practices in numerous ways. As more boards participate in cybersecurity budget discussions, we saw a 24% boost in cybersecurity spending. Notable outcomes cited by the survey respondents include the identification of key risks, fostering an organizational culture of security, better alignment of cybersecurity with overall risk management and business goals, and perhaps more than anything, board participation opened the lines of communication between the cybersecurity function and top executives and directors. When we view this as an enterprise-wide sort of program, we can do much, much better than when we think of it just as an IT program. And that's what this study seems to indicate. So one of the things that we went to with the boards is we started by saying we need to be thinking about cybersecurity differently. And how do we think about it differently? Well, first of all, the bad news, we're not going to solve the problem. We're going to manage the problem. Very different sort of thing. And we try to use metaphors for the boards, because the boards tend not to be cybersecurity sophisticated. They tend to look a lot like me, unfortunately, and they are what we call digital immigrants, not born into the digital world we're currently inhabiting. So one of the useful ways we get them to think about it is to think about cybersecurity kind of like we think about our personal health. All of us are under attack by germs all the time. The bad environment, whatever. But if you have good hygiene, you eat well, you exercise, etc., you can fight off most of these germs. Just like with good cyber hygiene, you can fight off lots of these attacks. But eventually, we all do get sick. There's going to be a successful attack, in which case you need an incident response plan, and you need a broad incident response plan. You need to have doctors. You need to know where your hospital is. Maybe you need several doctors. Maybe you need a cardiologist and a dermatologist and a psychologist, and you need to have an enterprise-wide, thinking of yourself here as the enterprise, risk management team so that you can manage your personal health better. And we need to be doing something similar with respect to cybersecurity. We also need to understand, and this is particularly for corporate boards, that there are different kinds of cyber risk. Remember I said this is not an easy problem. There are many manifestations of this. So particularly when boards of directors look at cybersecurity, again, there's not one cyber risk. There are multiple different kinds of cyber risks. So first of all, there's the data risk, which is the first thing we kind of tend to think of, the loss of data, the corruption of data, the freezing of data with encryption and ransomware attacks, those kinds of things. And that is much an IT problem. We're going to talk about the fact that it can't be managed just through IT in just a minute. But it's more of an IT problem. Then you have the legal risks. And the legal risks, threat of suit, regulatory fines, that kind of thing, this is really much more a compliance issue than a security issue. And it's very important to understand that compliance is not the same thing as security. Compliance is compliance. Compliance means you followed some rules that some organization set down, and maybe they will help and maybe they won't. Frankly, they haven't generally been assessed to see whether or not the compliance regimes actually improve security, but you have to follow them anyway. But you can be completely regulatorily in compliance and still have a tremendous data risk, where everybody's talking about GDPR, the General Directive on Regulation on Privacy, and you can be 100% in compliance with GDPR, protecting all the personal data, and lose all of your intellectual property to a cyber attack. They are not the same sort of thing. And finally, you have the reputational risk, which is very, very important, particularly to corporations. And again, the reputational risk has nothing necessarily to do with the actual data risk. So for example, how many people in the room remember hearing about the Target attack? Anybody remember Target? Okay. And how many of you remember the eBay attack? Same week. Everybody remembers Target because they managed it badly. Everybody remembers Equifax, I think mostly because they managed it badly. eBay, not so much. There's lots of very sophisticated attacks. So actually, it's the public relations function that is more important to a corporation in terms of protecting their reputational risk from a cyber incident. So what's in this book? So there are 5 basic principles that we try to teach. 1, cybersecurity is not an IT issue. It is an enterprise-wide risk management issue, very different thing. 2, boards need, you don't spell need, by the way, with a 4 in the middle most times. I do sometimes because it's interesting. Sorry for the typo. Boards need to understand their unique legal environment. There is no one legal environment with respect to cybersecurity. It's an evolving structure, evolving very, very quickly, in fact. Third, they need to assess cybersecurity expertise. Most boards do not have adequate cybersecurity expertise. With this particular audience, I'm going to kind of leave those three where they are. If I talk to a board of directors, I talk more about those three principles because those are the three principles that we deal with for the board to act as the board. The last two principles are, I think, more potentially relevant to today's audience, and these are the two principles dealing with senior management. What should senior management be providing to the board? So the fourth principle is that management needs to provide the board with a complete, not just an IT, a complete cyber risk framework. And there are lots of IT cyber risk frameworks. There's the NIST framework, there's ISO standards, there's PCI, there's a whole bunch of those. A lot of corporations mix and match them, which is fine. But it's not just that, and we'll talk about some of the differences in just a moment. And then management must provide the boards with a full risk assessment. We need to know what risks we're going to accept. Because that's what we do. We do accept risk. That's what corporations do. They accept risk. Then what ones can you mitigate through various techniques, some technical, some managerial? And then what ones can you transfer? And that's the full risk management procedure. In a couple of minutes, I want to talk about how the risk management field is progressing, and we have some, I think, sophisticated moves in that direction, which are very, very positive. Then at the back of the book, we have these various, this is actually the most popular part of the book for corporate boards, which is the appendices, 1 or 2 page lists of what are the questions you ask when you're doing supply chain, when you're doing insider risks. One of the things that made this book attractive to the corporate boards, we are told by the NACD, is that for years and years, people were talking about we needed to get the boards involved in cybersecurity, and what they really meant was we need to teach them IT. Guess what? The boards really don't want to learn about IT. You know, talk about NIST frameworks and ISO standards, the eyes glass over immediately. They start grabbing their iPhones. So what we did instead was we took the issues that boards care about, mergers, acquisitions, strategic partnerships, innovation, development of new product, and we embedded cybersecurity within those issues. So, board of directors, what are the cybersecurity questions you need to be asking when you're doing a merger? And there are lots of them. What are the cybersecurity questions you need when you're launching a new product and you're developing a new international supply chain? And there are a lot of them. What we need to do is take cybersecurity away from where it has historically been functioning, for the boards anyway, which is as incident management, you know, we're going to get hacked, what are we going to do? To bring it into the full business cycle. Make it part of every discussion. There is no business decision in 2018 and beyond that does not have an important cybersecurity component to it. Every business decision has a financial component. Every business decision has a legal component. And in the modern era, every business decision has a cybersecurity component. All of these things need to be blended in and managed throughout the entire business cycle. And that's what we try to do with these appendices. So I talked a little bit about the corporate management structure. So not only do you need a framework for your technology, your IT, et cetera, NIST, whatever, but also you need to have a management framework. This is a publication we came out with the National Association of Standards Institute, American National Standards Institute, rather, a couple of years ago. And what we do here is we outline an enterprise-wide cybersecurity issue. And much as Michael said in the earlier presentation, we need to have people managing this who are not just IT people. It needs to be an enterprise-wide cyber risk management team. It ought to have a separate budget, and it ought to be managed by somebody like a chief risk officer or chief operations officer, somebody with enterprise-wide vision, not the IT guy. I mean, there's an old saying that, you know, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you got the IT people running the problem, you're going to get IT solutions. And you need to have them in the conversation, but they should not be the only people having the conversation. Human resources is just as big a problem as the IT guys. In fact, you know, the number one vulnerability is the human beings in the system. There's an old saying in automotive safety that, you know, the most insecure part of the car is the nut behind the wheel. You know, same sort of thing as cybersecurity. So what this is, it goes through all the different strategies for the CFO, the human resources, legal compliance people. One of the things we found when we did this study was that each of these departments view cybersecurity completely differently. If you talk about cybersecurity with the human resources people, you might as well be talking a different language from the compliance people, let alone the IT people. So all these people need to be working together in order to have a modern and sophisticated cyber risk management program, because these are the skills that we have found you need for good cybersecurity risk management. It's not just IT. You need a team that has critical thinking skills. They need to have an understanding of probability. They need to have somebody who has training in calibrated estimation. They need to have some comfort with numbers. They need to be familiar with sophisticated decision-making models, Monte Carlo modeling and the things like that. And they need to be familiar with the business. One of the problems with having the IT people running cybersecurity is they tend not to know anything about the business. They know about the business, they don't know about the IT system, but they don't know, why are we doing this? What's the business plan involved? This needs to be understood if you're going to have the entire business process included. I mentioned that we have some useful advances that we're seeing in the field now with respect to cybersecurity risk management. The traditional way of looking at cybersecurity risk management was that you got these lists. It's called the policy approach. And this is, by the way, what the government tends to use. They use policy approach as opposed to risk management, which is a different thing. And basically what that comes is checking boxes. You'll have a list of 100, sometimes 500 boxes you're supposed to check off. And nobody checks them all off. Nobody has that kind of money. Problem is, we don't know which boxes need to be checked first. And if we check 80 boxes, are we getting much more security by checking 81? Or is that de minimis at this stage? Do we have to get to 90 before we get real impact, or is it at 120? Or maybe it's at 50. We don't know. And so we develop a whole bunch of bogus math based on this checking the box system that we really don't have. So actually, when it comes down to developing these models, that we tend to have traditionally, really what it is a bunch of guys sitting around the table saying, well, what do you think, Bill? I don't know. I think it's a green threat. Nah, I think it's a yellow threat. All right, we'll call it yellow. You went with me on green last week. We're going to call this one yellow, okay? Okay. And that's what gets reported up to the board. And the board looks at it and says, well, it's a 3. What's the difference between a 3 and a 4? It's 3.5? Anyway, this is bogus math. Garbage in, garbage out. So what we need is to develop prioritization, cost-based empirical models of cyber risk, and fortunately we are doing it. The market is responding in this space. We are now seeing new risk management models come to the fore that focus more on the impacts of the attack than the number of attacks. Boards for years have been getting these reports on how many incidents were recorded and how many viruses were blocked. It's meaningless math. What you need to know is not how many attacks there were, but how the attacks are implementing you. You need to focus not just on the perimeter, because remember, we're in a post-perimeter world. The bad guys can get in if they want to get into. We need clear terms, better scoping, no bogus math, place events in quantitative economic terms. This is what we need to do. We need to invest the economics into cybersecurity, because eventually this all comes down to a cost thing. Remember, the Pentagon wasn't willing to go with the $2 excessive cost, probably prohibited by somebody to do it. Corporations have the same thing. We're already seeing, I was trumpeting earlier in my presentation, this 24% increase in cybersecurity risk spending, and that's great, except boards are now beginning to get exhausted. And they're telling the CISO, we're not going to increase your budget 25% every year. You need to be able to tell us where this prioritizes in terms of the risk in the business. What do we need to keep spending on, and what don't we need to be spending on? And in order to get these models, we need to develop this, and we are developing. So you can now go online, and you can find things like the FAIR Institute, which is a sophisticated model that uses cyber risk management, puts it into context, develops some economics around it. X Analytics is another one of them. AIG has taken some of these more sophisticated models and slimmed them down for small businesses. So we are actually making substantial progress with respect to how to do more sophisticated cyber risk management. This is a new and a better system for government and industry. So I want to quickly turn to some public policy issues. So this is the social contract document that I referred to before. This document was the basis of the GOP Task Force reports on cybersecurity and the Obama Executive Order on Cybersecurity 13636. And basically what it does is it argues that we need to invest economics into cybersecurity, which, by the way, is what we have traditionally done. So if you go back 100 years, the hot technologies 100 years ago were telephones and distributed electricity. And in the beginning, private companies offered these sophisticated, cutting-edge services where it made economic sense, high-density areas and affluent areas. And then the wise policymakers of the era went to them and said, you know, we need universal service. So if you companies will agree to provide universal telephone and electricity service at reasonable rates, we will guarantee the rate of return on your investments, which is how we invented the anomaly known as the privately owned public utility. And that's why utilities for a century were great investments, because the rate of return was essentially guaranteed. What we did is we made it economic for these companies to do social good. That is the social contract that we are talking about. And it recognizes that government and industry analyze cybersecurity risk in a different way. So we have commercial level security. Everybody knows that 10% of the inventory is walking out the back door every month. Well, why don't we hire more guards and put up more cameras? Because it's going to cost 11%. It's an economic decision. Government doesn't have that liberty. They've got national security decisions, they've got privacy concerns, they've got political concerns. There's a delta between commercial level security and national security, but in the digital world, we're all using the same network. So we are going to have to find a way to elevate commercial security spending to a national security level and make it sustainable. We need to find these sorts of economic incentives that people found 100 years ago. We think we can do that. What the administration is beginning to do is develop what they think is a new model called collective security. So the Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity, Janet Manfra, made a speech just before the holidays where she said, we need to move beyond partnership, and industry needs to be investing in the public interest. Industry can't invest in the public interest. It's against the law. Sarbanes-Oxley says they need to be investing to maximize shareholder value. So we've got a problem here. How do we manage this? So we've pulled back, and we have begun to try to do this in a collective way. So the Information Technology Sector Coordinating Council, together with DHS, has now moved together to see if we can come up with this economic model to find a way to fill that gap that I talked about between government and industry. The mission of that program is to combine advanced technology with business economics and public policy to create a sustainable system of cybersecurity, because the bad guys, as I mentioned before, are attacking all of us. So some of the things the private sector is asking for is that we need much more help from the government on small companies who don't have the economies of scale that larger companies have. We need to implement a lot of the existing recommendations that haven't been made from the House Republican Task Force report and the Obama Executive Order. We need to dramatically enhance our law enforcement efforts. We can't be looking at this just as a critical infrastructure issue. We need to correct the market distortion by providing some good actor incentives, some reasons to make it profitable to be more secure, even if it's not in the traditional market. We need to streamline some of the existing regulations. One of the problems is everybody wants to be the cyber cop now. 15 years ago, I had to spell cyber when I walked into a government office. Now everybody wants to be cyber. The problem is we now have a weed-like structure of cyber regulations going everywhere, some of which are redundant, some of which are conflicting, and we don't have enough cybersecurity people. So we can't have them doing meaningless compliance. We need them over here doing actual security. So we need to streamline some of those regulations, and we need to update our incident response plans. Some of the things the government is looking for is to work with industry to develop a common operating picture, increase information sharing, create innovative solutions, and develop a more adequate cybersecurity workforce, some of which we talked about in the first session. So a lot for us to do together. And since I'm in an educational institution, I figured where to go but to Shakespeare for this. And you know what Shakespeare said? Shakespeare said, some are born great, some strive hard to achieve greatness, and others have greatness thrust upon you. Those of you who are here at Thomas Edison, attending cybersecurity conference, I suggest you've had greatness thrust upon you. We need your help to develop some of those creative solutions, to implement some of these more sophisticated programs. We need to be working together, government, industry, and the people all working together. That's the only way I can figure out how to manage this problem. So thank you very much.
Any questions?
Just walking. I've been doing that for years, Joe.
I can do it without money.
Michelle Schapp, and I'd like to first thank you for not saying kill all the lawyers. I'm an attorney. My question to you, you alluded to law enforcement and everybody wants to be the cyber cop. Do you think that one of the reasons why we've got 50 different states with 50 different breach notification statutes, and I think the attorney generals really are pushing against having a national framework, and I'm not suggesting we should have GDPR because I think that's on steroids, but do you think that they don't have faith that central government would enforce the way that the states are?
Great question. I don't think that that's the problem. Frankly, I think the problem is turf, is that the states, all want to be the cyber guy. You put out press releases if you're a state senator, you pass that cybersecurity bill. And what we need is not a national standard, we need a national ceiling. Because if you have a national standard that's a floor, we still have that same problem, because everybody will be, doing various things above the floor. So we need to come to a national agreement as to what are the minimums that we need to protect consumers, and then have everybody follow that so that we can develop some economies of scale, which are really important in terms of solving the problem. I mean, we're already seeing reports of 30–40% of cybersecurity budgets being diverted to redundant compliance regimes. That's 40% of our effort that is being wasted. And as I said, we don't have enough people, as Michael was saying at the very beginning. I mean, we're hundreds of thousands of people short. So we need to be much more efficient about this. And to do this, some people are going to have to decide to give up some turf.
Now
Yes.
I got the mic.
Yes, young man.
Joe Jarzmak with Synopsis. A great message, and not just characterizing the challenges that we've got, but also solution space. But actually, the challenges are far worse now. In the terms of what was not specified, is that we're now seeing cyber exploitation actually contributing to physical harm. People are dying. We actually can show this, and actually, we know there's far more who've died, but you can't prove it because there's no data logging, no data recording. Many of these devices are being hacked. People are dying. They say the patient died, this accident occurred. So what are we doing to address that? I mean, you talk about legal issues, and maybe that's the way you put it, where enterprises are now responsible for people dying as a result of them not taking action. Has that been part of the discussions as well?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's part of the interact. I mean, the notion that there's a distinction between cybersecurity and physical security is, again, one of the things that's kind of melting away because, I mean, we don't even have keys to get into our cars anymore, right? It's all cyber. So the notion of physical security is passé in the sense that there are physical systems that protect us as opposed to cyber systems. That's why we need an enterprise-wide approach. So that includes the physical security and the IT security people all together and working together and overcoming their own turf issues. But absolutely it's a problem. And I'll say something else, Joe. It's even more of a problem now. I mean, one of the, I'm not an expert on nuclear trees or anything, but I saw some of the analysis that came out just yesterday when President Trump decided to back out of the Iranian deal that said, that there's likely to be an increase in Iranian attacks, cyber leading to physical, from some of the crazies. One of the real silver linings of cybersecurity over the past several years, I mean, Joe and I both remember 10 years or so ago, there was bills in Congress where people were saying, the cyber attacks are going to come, they're going to take down the electric grid and stuff like that, and people like myself are saying it's not going to happen, it didn't happen. The reason it didn't happen is because the only people who could do that then were the Chinese and the Russians, and they were legitimate governments, and they knew that if they took down the U.S. electric grid, it would crash the U.S. economy, which, by the way, would crash the Chinese economy because they own half our debt. It would crash so there was a mutual assured destruction thing. That's not the case with the Iranians. And in particular, some of those Iranian contractors that they deal with who are the real crazies. And cyber attacks are now becoming so much easier to launch that people who don't have that kind of broad nation state, sophisticated nation state perspective, now we're getting into it, and it makes it much more dangerous. Yes, you're right. It's getting much more dangerous.
Larry, I just want to clarify something. Ernest Wannick, System 1. When you mentioned earlier about solutions, you talked about the utilities, and I'm assuming you're not actually advocating the utilization of that model, but but really talking about developing an incentive service, because I don't see how a utility model really is going to work in the 21st century.
Of course not. No, you're absolutely right. That was the model that was used in the 20th century for that particular thing. We would need a different model. But there are really good models of incentives that we use throughout the economy to get to make profitable pro-social activity that is not previously profitable. So, for example, if you're in pharmaceuticals, you have access to a fast-track method to get your drugs approved if you have a good safety record. That's very, very valuable. Getting your drug to market a little bit faster, very, very valuable, and it provides an incentive to maintain good safety with your other drugs. In the utility space, you have cap and trade, so that a utility that exceeds the standards for cleaning up the air can now take that excess and sell it to another entity, which means the entire environment is improved because we're incentivizing big players to bring down emissions much more, but we're doing it by providing them with an economic incentive to do this. There are examples in agriculture, aviation, ground transport, transportation, even in security. We have the Safety Act, which is a physical security law that provides insurance and public relations incentives. Problem is we haven't taken these incentive models and applied them to cybersecurity, and that's what we're going to try to do with this. But no, that one model wouldn't work.
Hi, so I was just wondering if you foresee any C-level board of directors facing criminal sanctions for not doing their due diligence, and do you believe that this would incentivize them to do, I guess, more of a better job creating more of a defense in-depth kind of infrastructure for their security and their IT departments?
No, I really don't. The reality is that virtually all the suits that have been filed have failed. Even the Target thing, the Target CEO lost his job because of a failed merger in Canada, not because of the cyber thing. And in fact, sad to say, but the actual data indicates that once you have these high-profile attacks, stock prices tend to go up. So if you look at the actual stock prices for Target, their stock price was up, I think, 36% 6 months following their attack. Sony's was up 40.
That is starting to change.
Well, yeah, I've been hearing that for about 15 years. Hasn't changed yet. There was a new book just came out by Andrea Beaumont-Blanc, who did a full study of it, and she found in the main prices increased 7% following these major things. So the 30% may be anomaly. But the reason is because we're thinking of these. We go to a cybersecurity conference, we just talk to cybersecurity people, but that's not the way investors do it. So the investors looked at Target and they said, "Oh, look at that price drop," because the price does drop with bad publicity right away. Oh, it's price, good distribution network, like their price point, pretty good advertising team, buy opportunity. Stock goes back up. So we're not seeing it. That the beat up the CEO answer is not the case. It's also very hard to prove the case. I mean, you have to be reasonable. Well, if the Pentagon can't be secure, how are you going to convince a jury that you're unreasonable? You just walk in with the annual report from the Pentagon. It says anybody can get into these systems. So I think the punitive model, highlighted, by the way, by GDPR, which I think is a terrible idea, is really not going to work. Instead of beating each other up over this, we need to work together on this. The bad guys are attacking industry, they're attacking government, they're attacking people. We're the good guys. We need to be working together against the bad guys who are over there. When we point fingers at each other and spend our time doing this, that's just publicity, and it's not going to work. It isn't working. Hasn't worked for 15 years. and I don't see it going to work. So, no, it's a 21st century problem. We need 21st century solutions. That's a 20th century solution, in my opinion.